Section 6 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Chapter 6. The Psychological Peculiarities of Dreams. In our scientific investigation of dreams, we start with the assumption that dreams are a phenomenon of our own psychic activity. Yet, the completed dream appears to us as something alien, whose authorship we are little inclined to recognize, that we should be just as willing to say, "A dream came to me," as "I dreamed." Whence this psychic strangeness of dreams? According to our exposition of the sources of dreams, we must assume that it is not determined by the material which finds its way into the dream content, since this is for the most part common both to dream life and waking life. We might ask ourselves whether this impression is not evoked by modifications of psychic process in dreams, and we might even attempt to suggest that the existence of such changes is the psychological characteristic of dreams. No one has more strongly emphasized the essential difference between dream life and waking life, and drawn more far-reaching conclusions from this difference, than G.T.H. Fechner in certain observations contained in his Element des Psychophysiques. He believed that neither the simple depression of conscious psychic life under the main threshold, nor the distraction of the attention from the influences of the outer world, suffices to explain the peculiarities of dream life as compared with the waking life. He believes rather that the arena of dreams is other than the arena of the waking life of the mind. If the arena of psychophysical activity were the same during the sleeping and the waking state, the dream, in my opinion, would only be a continuation of the waking ideational life at a lower degree of intensity, so that it would have to partake of the form and material of the latter. But this is by no means the case. What Fechner really meant by such a transposition of the psychic activity has never been made clear, nor has anybody else, to my knowledge, followed the path which he indicates in his remark. An anatomical interpretation in the sense of physiological localization in the brain, or even a histological stratification of the cerebral cortex, must of course be excluded. The idea might, however, prove ingenious and fruitful if it could refer to a psychical apparatus built up of a number of successive and connected systems. Other authors have been content to give prominence to this or that palpable psychological peculiarity of the dream life, and even to take this as a starting point for more comprehensive attempts at explanation. It has been justly remarked that one of the chief peculiarities of dream life makes its appearance even in the state of falling asleep, and may be defined as the sleep heralding phenomenon. According to Schleiermacher, the distinguishing characteristic of waking state is the fact that its psychic activity occurs in the form of ideas rather than in that of images. But dream thinks mainly in visual images. And it may be noted that with the approach of sleep, the voluntary activities become impeded in proportion as involuntary representations make their appearance, the latter belonging entirely to the category of images. The incapacity for such ideational activities as we feel to be deliberately willed, and the emergence of visual images, which is regularly connected with this distraction, these two are constant characteristic of dreams, and on psychological analysis we are compelled to recognize them as essential characteristics of dream life. As for the images themselves, the hypnagogic hallucinations, we have learned that even in their content, they are identical with dream images. Dreams, then, think preponderantly, but not exclusively, in visual images. They make use also of auditory images, and to a lesser extent of the other sensory impressions. Moreover, in dreams, as in the waking state, many things are simply thought and imagined, probably with the help of remnants of verbal conceptions. Characteristic of dreams, however, are only those elements of their contents which behave like images, that is, which more closely resemble perceptions than mnemonic representations. Without entering upon a discussion of nature of hallucinations, a discussion familiar to every psychiatrist, we may say, with every well-informed authority, that the dream hallucinates, that is, that it replaces thoughts by hallucinations. In this respect, visual and acoustic impressions behave in the same way. It has been observed that the recollection of a succession of notes heard as we are falling asleep becomes transformed, when we have fallen asleep, into a hallucination of the same melody, to give place, each time we wake, to the fainter and qualitatively different representations of the memory, and resuming, each time we doze off again, its hallucinatory character. The transformation of an idea into a hallucination is not the only departure of the dream from the more or less corresponding waking thought. From these images, the dream creates a situation. It represents something as actually present. It dramatizes an idea, as Peta puts it. But the peculiar character of this aspect of the dream life is completely intelligible only if we admit that in dreaming we do not, as a rule, the exceptions call for special examination, suppose ourselves to be thinking, but actually experiencing. That is, we accept the hallucinations in perfectly good faith. The criticism that one has experienced nothing, but that one has merely been thinking in a peculiar manner, dreaming, occurs to us only on waking. It is this characteristic which distinguishes the genuine dream from the daydream, which is never confused with reality. The characteristics of the dream life, thus far considered, have been summed up by Budak as follows. As characteristic features of the dream, we may state a. That the subjective activity of our psyche appears as objective, inasmuch as our perceptive faculties apprehend the products of fantasy as though they were sensory activities. B. That sleep abrogates our voluntary action, hence falling asleep involves a certain degree of passivity. The images of sleep are conditioned by the relaxation of our powers of will. It now remains to account for the credulity of the mind in respect to the dream hallucinations, which are able to make their appearance only after the suspension of certain voluntary powers. Strumpel asserts that in this respect the psyche behaves correctly and in conformity with its mechanism. The dream elements are by no means mere representations, but true and actual experiences of the psyche, similar to those which come to the waking state by the way of senses. Whereas, in the waking state, the mind thinks and imagines by means of verbal images and language. In dream, it thinks and imagines in actual perceptual images. Dreams, moreover, reveal a spatial consciousness, inasmuch as in dreams, just as in the waking state, sensations and images are transposed into outer space. It must therefore be admitted that in dreams the mind preserves the same attitude in respect of images and perceptions as in the waking state. But if it forms erroneous conclusions in respect of these images and perceptions, this is due to the fact that in sleep it is deprived of that criterion which alone can distinguish between sensory perceptions emanating from within and those coming from without. It is unable to subject its images to those tests which alone can prove their objective reality. Further, it neglects to differentiate between those images which can be exchanged at will and those in respect of which there is no free choice. It does, because it cannot apply the law of causality to the content of its dreams. In brief, its alienation from the outer world is the very reason for its belief in the subjective dream world. Delboeuf arrives at the same conclusion through a somewhat different line of argument. We believe in the reality of dream pictures because in sleep we have no other impressions with which to compare them, because we are cut off from the outer world. But it is not because we are unable, when asleep, to test our hallucinations that we believe in their reality. Dreams can make us believe that we are applying such tests, that we are touching, say, the rose that we see in our dream, and yet we are dreaming. According to Delboeuf, there is no valid criterion that can show whether something is a dream or a waking reality, except, and that only pragmatically, the fact of waking. I conclude that all that has been experienced between falling asleep and waking is a delusion. If I find on waking that I am lying undressed in bed, I considered the images of my dream real while I was asleep on the account of unsleeping mental habit of assuming an outer world with which I can contrast my ego. Hafner, like Delboeuf, has attempted to explain the act of dreaming by the alteration which an abnormally introduced condition must have upon the otherwise correct functioning of the intact psychic apparatus. But he describes this condition in a somewhat different terms. He states that the first distinguishing mark of dreams is the abolition of time and space, that is, the emancipation of the representation from the individual's position in the spatial and temporal order. Associated with this is the second fundamental character of dreams, the mistaking of the hallucinations, imaginations, and fantasy combinations for objective perceptions. The sum total of the higher psychic functions, particularly the formation of concepts, judgments, and conclusions on the one hand, and the free self-determination on the other hand, combined with the sensory fantasy images, and at all times have these as substratum. These activities too, therefore, participate in the erratic nature of the dream representations. We say they participate, for our faculties of judgment and will are in themselves unaltered during sleep. As far as their activity is concerned, we are just as shrewd and just as free as in the waking state. A man cannot violate the laws of thought. That is, even in a dream, he cannot judge things to be identical, which present themselves to him as opposites. He can desire in a dream only that which he regards as good. Sub ratione boni. But in this application of the laws of thought and will, the human intellect is led astray in dreams by confusing one notion with another. Thus it happens that in dreams we formulate and commit the greatest of contradictions, while on the other hand we display the shrewdest judgment and arrive at the most logical conclusions, and are able to make the most virtuous and sacred resolutions. The lack of orientation is the whole secret of our flights of fantasy in dreams, and the lack of critical reflection and agreement with other minds is the main source of the reckless extravagances of our judgments, hopes, and wishes in dreams. If the turning away from the outer world is accepted as the decisive cause of the most conspicuous characteristics of our dreams, it will be worth our while to consider certain subtle observations of Buddhas, which will throw some light on the relation of the sleeping psyche to the outer world, and at the same time serve to prevent the overestimating the importance of the above deductions. Sleep, says Buddha, results only under the condition that the mind is not excited by sensory stimuli. Yet, it is not so much a lack of sensory stimuli that conditions sleep, as a lack of interest in them. Some sensory impressions are even necessary, in so far as they serve to calm the mind. Thus, the miller can fall asleep only when he hears the clatter of his mill, and he who finds it necessary, as a matter of precaution, to burn a light at night cannot fall asleep in the dark. During sleep, the psyche isolates itself from the outer world and withdraws from the periphery. Nevertheless, the connection is not entirely broken. If one did not hear and feel during sleep, but only after waking, one would assuredly never be awakened at all. The continuance of sensation is even more plainly shown by the fact that we are not always awakened by the mere force of the sensory impression, but by its relation to the psyche. An indifferent word does not arouse the sleeper, but if called by name, he wakes. So that, even in sleep, the psyche discriminates between sensations. Hence, one may even be awakened by the obliteration of a sensory stimulus, if this is related to anything of the imagined importance. Thus one man wakes when the night light is extinguished, and the miller when his mill comes to a standstill. That is, waking is due to the cessation of a sensory activity, and this presupposes that the activity has been perceived, but has not disturbed the mind, its effect being indifferent or actually reassuring. Even if we are willing to disregard these by no means trifling objections, we must yet admit that the qualities of the dream life, hitherto considered, which are attributed to withdrawal from the outer world, cannot fully account for the strangeness of dreams. For otherwise, it would be possible to reconvert the hallucinations of the dream into mental images, and the situations of the dreams into thoughts, and thus to achieve the task of dream interpretation. Now this is precisely what we do when we reproduce a dream from memory after waking, and no matter whether we are fully or only partially successful in this retranslation, the dream still remains as mysterious as before. Furthermore, all writers unhesitatingly assume that still other and profounder changes take place in the plastic material of waking life. Strumpel seeks to isolate one of these changes as follows. With the cessation of active sensory perception and of normal consciousness, the psyche is deprived of the soil in which its feelings, desires, interests, and activities are rooted. Those psychic states, feelings, interests, and valuations, which in the waking state adhere to the memory images, succumb to an obscuring pressure, in consequence of which their connection with these images is severed. The perceptual images of things, persons, localities, events, and actions of the waking state are individually, abundantly reproduced, but none of these brings with it its psychic value. Deprived of this, they hover in the mind, dependent on their own resources. The annihilation of psychic values, which is in turn referred to a turning away from the outer world, is, according to Strumpel, very largely responsible for the impression of strangeness with which the dream is colored in our memory. We have seen that the very fact of falling asleep involves a renunciation of one of the psychic activities, namely, the voluntary guidance of the flow of ideas. Thus, the supposition obtrudes itself, though it is in any case a natural one, that the state of sleep may extend even to the psychic functions. One or another of these functions is perhaps entirely suspended. We have now to consider whether the rest continue to operate undisturbed, whether they are able to perform their normal work under the circumstances. The idea occurs to us that the peculiarities of the dream may be explained by the restricted activity of the psyche during sleep, and the impression made by the dream upon our waking judgment tends to confirm this view. The dream is incoherent. It reconciles, without hesitation, the worst contradictions. It admits impossibilities. It disregards the authoritative knowledge of the waking state, and it shows us as ethically and morally obtuse. He who should behave in the waking state as his dream represents him as behaving would be considered insane. He who in the waking state should speak as he does in his dream, or relate such things as occur in his dreams, would impress us as a feeble-minded or muddle-headed person. It seems to us then that we are merely speaking in accordance with the facts of the case when we rate psychic activity in dreams very low, and especially when we assert that in dreams the higher intellectual activities are suspended, or at least greatly impaired. With unusual unanimity, the exceptions will be dealt with elsewhere. The writers on the subject have pronounced such judgments as led immediately to a definitive theory and explanation of dream life. It is now time to supplement the resume which I have just given by a series of quotations from a number of authors, philosophers, and physicians bearing upon the psychological characteristics of the dream. According to Lemon, the incoherence of the dream images is the sole essential characteristic of the dream. Maury agrees with him.
Il n'y a pas de rêve absolument raisonnable et qui ne contienne quelque incohérence, quelque absurdité.
There are no dreams which are absolutely reasonable, which do not contain some incoherence, some absurdity. According to Hegel, quoted by Spitta, the dream lacks any intelligible objective coherence. Dugas says,
Le rêve, c'est l'anarchie physique, affective et mentale. C'est le jeu de fonctions livrées et elles-mêmes et exerçant sans contrôle et sans but. Dans le rêve, l'esprit est un automate spirituel.
The dream is psychic anarchy, emotional and intellectual. The playing of functions freed of themselves and performing without control and without end. In the dream, the mind is a spiritual automaton. The relaxation, dissolution, and promiscuous confusion of the world of ideas and images held together in waking life by the logical power of the central ego is conceded even by Folke, according to whose theory the psychic activity during sleep appears to be by no means aimless. The absurdity of the associations of ideas which occur in dreams can hardly be more strongly stigmatized than it was by Cicero.
Nihil tam prepostre tam incondite, tam monstruas cogitari potast, quod non possimus sominare.
There is no imaginable thing too absurd, too involved, or too abnormal for us to dream about. Fechner says, it is as though the psychological activity of the brain of a reasonable person were to migrate into that of a fool. Radestock, it seems indeed impossible to recognize any stable laws in this preposterous behavior. Withdrawing itself from its strict policing of the rational will that guides our waking ideas and form the process of attention, the dream, in crazy sport, whirls all things about in a kaleidoscopic confusion. Hildebrand, what wonderful jumps the dreamer permits himself, for instance, in his chain of reasoning. With what unconcern he sees the most familiar laws of experience turned upside down. What ridiculous contradictions he is able to tolerate in the order of nature and of society, before things go too far, and the very excess of nonsense leads to an awakening. Sometimes we quite innocently calculate that 3 times 3 makes 20. And we are not in the least surprised if a dog recites poetry to us, if a dead person walks to his grave, or if a rock floats on the water. We solemnly go to visit the Duchy of Bernburg, or the Principality of Liechtenstein, in order to inspect its navy, or we allow ourselves to be recruited as a volunteer by Charles XII just before the Battle of Poltava. Binz, referring to the theory of dreams resulting from these impressions, says, of 10 dreams, 9 at least have an absurd content. We unite in them persons or things which do not appear slightest relation to one another. In the next moment, as in a kaleidoscope, the grouping changes to one, if possible, even more nonsensical and irrational than before. And so, the shifting play of the drowsy brain continues, until we wake, put a hand to our forehead, and ask ourselves whether we still really possess the faculty of rational imagination and thought. Maury Le Sommeil makes in respect of the relation of the dream image to the waking thoughts a comparison which a physician will find especially impressive.
La production de ces images que chez l'homme éveillé fait le plus souvent naître le volant, correspond pour l'intelligence, et ce que sont pour la mortalité certains moments qui nous offrent la courrier et les affections paralytiques.
The production of those images which, in the waking man, most often excite the will, correspond for the mind to those which are, for the motility, certain movements that offer sensuous dance and paralytic affections. For the rest, he considers the dream
toute une série de dégradations de la faculté pensante et raisonnante,
a whole series of degradations of the faculty of thinking and reasoning. It's hardly necessary to cite the utterances of those authors who repeat Maury's assertions in respect of the higher individual psychic activities. According to Strumpel, in dreams, and even, of course, where the nonsensical nature of the dream is not obvious, all the logical operations of the mind, based on relations and associations, recede into the background. According to Spitta, ideas in dreams are entirely withdrawn from the laws of casuality, while Radstock and others emphasize the feebleness of judgment and logical inference peculiar to dreams. According to Jidal, there is no criticism in dreams, no correcting of a series of perceptions by the content of consciousness as a whole. The same author states that all the activities of consciousness occur in dreams, but they are imperfect, inhibited, and mutually isolated. The contradictions of our conscious knowledge which occur in dreams are explained by Stricker and many others on the ground that facts are forgotten in dreams, or that the logical relations between ideas are lost, etc., etc. Those authors who, in general, judge so unfavorably of the psychic activities of dreamer, nevertheless agree that dreams do retain a certain remnant of psychic activity. Wundt, whose teachings has influenced so many other investigators of dream problems, expressly admits this. We may ask, what are the nature and composition of the remnants of normal psychic life which manifest themselves in dreams? It is pretty generally acknowledged that the reproductive faculty, the memory, seems to be the least affected in dreams. It may indeed show a certain superiority over the same function in waking life, even though some of the absurdities of dreams are to be explained by the forgetfulness of dream life. According to Spitta, it is the sentimental life of the psyche which is not affected by sleep, and which thus directs our dreams. By sentiment, Gemut, he means the constant sum of the emotions as the inmost subjective essence of man. Scholz sees in dreams a psychic activity which manifests itself in the allegorizing interpretation to which the dream material is subjected. Seebeck, likewise, perceives in dreams a supplementary interpretative activity of the psyche, which applies itself to all that is observed and perceived. Any judgment of the part played in dreams by what is presumed to be the highest psychical function, that is consciousness, presents a peculiar difficulty, since it is only through consciousness that we can know anything of dreams. There can be no doubt as to its being retained. Spita, however, believes that only consciousness is retained in the dream, but not self-consciousness. Delbeuf confesses that he is unable to comprehend this distinction. The laws of association, which connect our mental images, hold good also for what is represented in dreams. Indeed, in dreams, the dominance of these laws is more obvious and complete than in waking state. Strumpel says, dreams would appear to proceed either exclusively in accordance with the laws of pure representation, or in accordance with the laws of organic stimuli accompanied by such representations, that is, without being influenced by reflection, reason, aesthetic taste, or moral judgment. The authors whose opinions I here reproduce conceive the formation of the dream somewhat as follows. The sum of sensory stimuli of varying origin, discussed elsewhere, that are operative in sleep at first, awaken in the psyche a number of images which present themselves as hallucinations. According to Wundt, it is more correct to say as illusions, because of their origin in external and internal stimuli. These combined with one another in accordance with the known laws of association, and in accordance with the same laws, they in turn evoke a new series of representations, images. The whole of this material is then elaborated as far as possible by the still active remnant of the thinking and organizing faculties of the psyche. Thus far, however, no one has been successful in discerning the motive which would decide what particular law of association is to be obeyed by those images which do not originate in external stimuli. But it has been repeatedly observed that the associations which connect the dream images with one another are of particular kind, differing from those found in the activities of the waking mind. Thus Folke, in dreams, the ideas chase and seize upon one another on the strength of accidental similarities and barely perceptible connections. All dreams are pervaded by casual and unconstrained associations of this kind. Maury attaches great value to this characteristic of the connection of ideas, for it allows him to draw a closer analogy between the dream life and certain mental derangements. He recognizes two main characteristics of the deliria. 1.
Une action spontanée et comme automatique de l'esprit.
An action of the mind spontaneous and as though automatic. 2.
Une association vicieuse et irrégulière des idées.
A defective and irregular association of ideas. Maury gives two excellent examples from his own dreams, in which the mere similarity of sound decides the connection between the dream representations. Once he dreamed that he was in a pèlerinage, to Jerusalem or to Mecca. After many adventures, he found himself in the company of the chemist Pelletier. The latter, after some conversation, gave him a galvanized shovel, pelle, which became his great broadsword in the next portion of the dream. In another dream, he is walking along a highway where he reads the distances on the kilometer stones. Presently he found himself at a grocer's, who had a large pair of scales. A man put kilogram weights into the scales in order to weigh Maury. The grocer then said to him, "You are not in Paris, but on the island Kilolo." This was followed by a number of pictures in which he saw the flower Lobelia, and then General Lopez, of whose death he had read a little while previously. Finally he awoke as he was playing a game of Lotto. We are, indeed, quite well aware that this low estimate of the psychic activities of the dream has not been allowed to pass without contradiction from various quarters. Yet here contradiction would seem rather difficult. It is not a matter of much significance that one of the depreciators of dream life, Spita, should assure us that the same psychological laws which govern the waking state to rule the dream also, or that another, Dugas, should state,
Le réveil n'est pas de raison ni même irraison pure.
the dream is neither pure derangement nor pure irrationality. So long as neither of them has attempted to bring this opinion into harmony with the psychic anarchy and the dissolution of all mental functions in the dream, which they themselves have described. However, the possibility seems to have dawned upon others that the madness of the dream is perhaps not without its method, that it is perhaps only a disguise, a dramatic pretense, like that of Hamlet, to whose madness the perspicacious judgment refers. These authors must either have refrained from judging by appearances, or appearances were, in their case, altogether different. Without lingering over its superficial absurdity, Havelock Ellis considers the dream as an anarchic world of vast emotions and imperfect thoughts, the study of which may acquaint us with the primitive stages of the development of mental life. J. Sully presents the same conception of the dream in a still more comprehensive and penetrating fashion. His statements deserve all the more consideration when it is added that he, perhaps more than any other psychologist, was convinced of the veiled significance of the dream. Now, our dreams are a means of conserving these successive personalities. When asleep, we go back to the old ways of looking at things and of feeling about them, to impulses and activities which long ago dominated us. A thinker like Delboeuf asserts without indeed adducing proof in the face of the contradictory data, and hence without real justification.
Dans le sommeil, hormis la perception, toutes les facultés de l'esprit, intelligence, imagination, mémoire, volonté, moralité, restent intactes dans leur essence. Seulement, elles s'appliquent à des objets imaginaires et mobiles. Le sanguin est un acteur qui joue à volant, le fou et le sages, le bourreau et la victime, le néant et le géant, le démon et les anges.
In sleep, excepting perception, all the faculties of the mind, intellect, imagination, memory, will, morality, remain intact in their essence. Only they are applied to imaginary and variable objects. The dreamer is an actor who plays at will the mad and the wise, executioner and victim, dwarf and giant, devil and angel. The Marquis Hervé, who is flatly contradicted by Maury, and whose essay I have been unable to obtain despite all my efforts, appears emphatically to protest against the underestimation of the psychic capacity in the dream. Maury speaks of him as follows.
Monsieur le Marquis Hervé prête à l'intelligence durant le sommeil toute sa liberté d'action et d'attention, et il ne semble faire consister le sommeil que dans l'occultation de sens, dans leur fermeture au monde extérieur, en sorte que l'homme qui dort ne se distingue guère, selon la manière de voir, de l'homme qui les éveille sa pensée en se bouchant le sens. Toute la différence qui séparait alors la pensée ordinaire de celle de dormir, c'est que, chez celui-ci, l'idée prend une forme visible, objective et ressemble à s'y même prendre à la sensation déterminée par l'objet extérieur. Le souvenir revêt l'apparence du fait présent.
The Marquis Hervé attributes to the intelligence during sleep all its freedom of action and attention, and he seems to make sleep consist only of the shutting of the senses, of their closing to the outside world. Except for his manner of seeing, the man asleep is hardly distinguishable from the man who allows his mind to wander while he obstructs his senses. The whole difference, then, between ordinary thought and that of the sleeper is that, with the latter, the idea takes an objective and visible shape, which resembles, to all appearances, sensations determined by exterior objects. Memory takes on the appearance of present fact. Maury adds, however,
qu'il y a une différence plus capitale à savoir que la faculté intellectuelle de l'homme endormi n'offre pas l'équilibre qu'elle se garde chez l'homme éveillé.
That there is a further and important difference in that the mental faculties of the sleeping man do not offer the equilibrium which they keep in the waking state. In Baschild, who gives us fully information as to Hervey's book, we find that this author expresses himself as follows in respect to the apparent incoherence of dreams.
L'image du réveil est la copie de la idée. Le principal est l'idée. La vision n'est pas qu'accessoire. Ceci établi, il faut savoir suivre la marche des idées, il faut savoir analyser le tissu des rêves. L'incohérence devient alors compréhensible. La conception les plus fantastiques devient des faits simples et parfaitement logiques.
The image in a dream is a copy of an idea. The main thing is the idea. The vision is only accessory. This established, it is necessary to know how to follow the progression of ideas, how to analyze the texture of the dreams. Incoherence, then, is understandable. The most fantastic concepts become simple and perfectly logical facts.
Les rêves les plus bizarres trouvent même une explication des plus logiques quand on sait les analyser.
Even the most bizarre dreams find a most logical explanation when one knows how to analyze them. J. Starke has drawn attention to the fact that a similar solution of the incoherence of dreams was put forward in 1799 by an old writer, Wolfe Davidson, who was unknown to me. The peculiar leaps of our imaginings in the dream state all have their cause in the laws of association, but this connection often occurs very obscurely in the soul, so that we frequently seem to observe a leap of imagination where none really exists. The evaluation of the dream as a psychic product in the literature of the subject varies over a very wide scale. It extends from the extreme of underestimation, as we have already seen, through premonitions that it may have a value as yet unrevealed, to an exaggerated overestimation, which sets the dream life far above the capacities of waking life. In a psychological characterization of dream life, Hildebrand, as we know, groups into three antinomies, and he combines in the third of these antinomies the two extreme points of this scale of values. In the contrast between, on the one hand, an enhancement, an increase of potentiality, which often amounts to virtuosity, and on the other hand, a decided diminution and enfeeblement of the psychic life, often to a subhuman level. As regards the first, who is there that cannot confirm from his own experience the fact that, in the workings and weavings of the genius of dreams, there are sometimes exhibited a profundity and sincerity of emotion, a tenderness of feeling, a clearness of view, a subtlety of observation, and a readiness of wit, such as we should have modestly to deny that we always possessed in our waking life. Dreams have a wonderful poetry, an apposite allegory, an incomparable sense of humour, a delightful irony. They see the world in a light of peculiar idealization, and often intensify the effect of their phenomena by the most ingenious understanding of the reality underlying them. They show us as earthly beauty in a truly heavenly radiance, the sublime in its most supremest majesty, and that which we know to be terrible in its most frightful form, but the ridiculous being indescribably and drastically comical. And on waking, we are sometimes still so full of one of these impressions that it will occur to us that such things have never yet been offered to us by the real world. One might here ask oneself, do these depreciatory remarks and these enthusiastic praises really refer to the same phenomena? Have some writers overlooked the foolish and the others the profound and sensitive dreams? And if both kinds of dreams do occur, that is, dreams that merit both these judgments, does it not seem idle to seek a psychological characterization of the dream? Would it not suffice to state that everything is possible in a dream, from the lowest degradation of the psychic life to its flight to heights unknown in the waking state? Convenient as such a solution might be, it has this against it, that behind the efforts of all the investigators of dreams, there seems to lurk the assumption that there is in dreams some characteristic which is universally valid in its essential features, and which must eliminate all these contradictions. It is unquestionably true that the mental capacities of dreams found readier and warmer recognition in the intellectual period now lying behind us, when philosophy rather than exact natural science ruled the most intelligent minds. Statements like that of Schubert, to the effect the dream frees the mind from the power of external nature, that it liberates the soul from the chains of sensory life, together with the similar opinions expressed by the younger Fichte, and others, who represent dreams as a soaring of the mind to a higher plane, all these seem hardly conceivable to us today. They are repeated at present only by mystics and devotees. With the advance of a scientific mode of thought, a reaction took place in the estimation of dreams. It is the medical writers who are most inclined to underrate the psychic activity in dreams, as being insignificant and valueless, while philosophers and unprofessional observers, amateur psychologists, whose contributions to the subject in especial must not be overlooked, have for the most part, in the agreement with the popular belief, laid emphasis on the psychological value of dreams. Those who are inclined to underrate the psychic activity of dreams naturally show a preference for the somatic sources of excitation in the etiology of the dream. Those who admit the dreaming mind may retain greater part of its waking faculties naturally have no motive for denying the existence of autonomous stimulations. Among the superior accomplishments which one may be tempted, even on a sober comparison, to ascribe to the dream life, that of the memory is the most impressive. We have fully discussed the by no means rare experiences which prove this superiority. Another privilege of the dream life, often extolled by the older writers, namely the fact that it can overstep the limitations of time and space, is easily recognized as an illusion. This privilege, as Hildebrand remarks, is merely illusory. Dreams disregard time and space only as does waking thought, and only because dreaming is itself a form of thinking. Dreams are supposed to enjoy a further advantage in respect of time, to be independent of the passage of time in yet another sense. Dreams, like Maury's dream of his execution, seem to show that the perceptual content which the dream can compress into a very short space of time far exceeds that which can be mastered by our psychic activity in its waking thoughts. These conclusions have, however, been disputed. The essays of Le Laurent and Egger on the apparent duration of dreams give rise to a long, interesting discussion, which, in all probability, has not yet found the final explanation of this profound and delicate problem. The dreams are able to continue the intellectual activities of the day, and to carry them to a point which could not be arrived at during the day, that they may resolve doubts and problems, and that they may be the source of fresh inspiration in poets and composers, seems, in the light of numerous records, and that of the collection of instances compiled by Chabanix, to be proved beyond question. But even though the facts may be beyond dispute, their interpretation is a subject to many doubts on wider grounds. Finally, the alleged divinatory power of the dream has become a subject of contention, in which almost insuperable objections are confronted by obstinate and reiterated assertions. It is of course right that we should refrain from denying that this view has any basis whatever in fact, since it is quite possible that a number of such cases may before long be explained on purely natural psychological grounds. End of section 6. Recording by Lambda.
Section 7 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 7. The Ethical Sense in Dreams. For reasons which will be intelligible only after consideration of my own investigations of dreams, I have isolated from the psychology of the dream the subsidiary problem as to whether or to what extent the moral dispositions and feelings of waking life extend into dream life. The same contradictions which we were surprised to observe in the descriptions by various authors of all the other psychic activities will surprise us again here. Some writers flatly assert that dreams know nothing of moral obligations. Others as decidedly declare that the moral nature of man persists even in his dream life. Our ordinary experience of dreams seems to confirm beyond all doubt the correctness of the first assertion. Sigmund says, "Nor does one become better or more virtuous during sleep. On the contrary, it seems that the conscience is silent in our dreams, inasmuch as one feels no compassion and can commit the worst of crimes, such as theft, murder, and homicide, with perfect indifference and without subsequent remorse." Raidstock says, "It is to be noted that in dreams associations are effected and ideas combined without being in any way influenced by reflection, reason, aesthetic taste, and moral judgment. The judgment is extremely weak, and ethical indifference reigns supreme." Volquet expresses himself as follows: "As everyone knows, dreams are especially unbridled in sexual matters. Just as the dreamer himself is shameless in the extreme and wholly lacking in moral feeling and judgment, so likewise does he see others, even the most respected persons, doing things which, even in his thoughts, he would blush to associate them with in his waking state." Utterances like those of Schopenhauer, that in dreams every man acts and talks in complete accordance with his character, are in sharpest contradiction to those mentioned above. R. F. Fischer maintains that the subjective feelings and desires, or effects and passions, manifest themselves in the wilfulness of the dream life, and that the moral characteristics of a man are mirrored in his dreams. Hafner says, "With rare exceptions, a virtuous man will be virtuous also in his dreams. He will resist temptation, and will show no sympathy for hatred, envy, anger, and all other vices, whereas the sinful man will, as a rule, encounter in his dreams the images which he has before him in the waking state." Schultz says, "In dreams there is truth despite all camouflage of nobility or degradation, and we recognize our true selves. The honest man does not commit a dishonoring crime even in his dreams, or if he does, he is appalled by it as something foreign to his nature. The Roman emperor who ordered one of his subjects to be executed because he dreamed that he had cut off the emperor's head was not far wrong in justifying his action on the ground that he who has such dreams must have similar thoughts while awake. Significantly enough, we say of things that find no place even in our intimate thoughts, 'I would never even dream of such a thing.' Plato, on the other hand, considers that they are the best men who only dream the things which other men do." Plath, varying a familiar proverb, says, "Tell me your dreams for a time, and I will tell you what you are within." The little essay of Hildebrandt, from which I have already taken so many quotations, the best expressed and the most suggestive contribution to the literature of the dream problem which I hitherto discovered, takes for its central theme the problem of morality in dreams. For Hildebrandt, too, it is an established rule that the purer the life, the purer the dream, the impurer the life, the impurer the dream. The moral nature of man persists even in dreams. But while we are not offended or made suspicious by an arithmetic error, no matter how obvious, by a reversal of scientific fact, no matter how romantic, by an anachronism, no matter how ridiculous, we nevertheless do not lose sight of the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice. No matter how much of that which accompanies us during the day may vanish in our hours of sleep, Kant's categorical imperative dogs our steps as an inseparable companion. of whom we cannot rid ourselves even in our slumber. This can be explained only by the fact that the fundamental element of human nature, the moral essence, is too firmly fixed to be subjected to the kaleidoscopic shaking up to which fantasy, reason, memory, and other faculties of the same order succumb in our dreams. In the further discussion of the subject we find in both these groups of authors remarkable evasions and inconsequences. Strictly speaking, all interest in immoral dreams should be at an end for those who assert that the moral personality of the individuals fall to pieces in their dreams. They could as coolly reject all attempts to hold the dreamer responsible for his dreams, or to infer from the immorality of his dreams that there is an immoral stain in his character, as they have rejected the apparently analogous attempt to prove from the absurdity of his dreams the worthlessness of his intellectual life in the waking state. The others, according to whom the categorical imperative extends even into the dream, ought to accept in total the notion of full responsibility for immoral dreams, and we can only hope that their reprehensible dreams do not lead them to abandon their otherwise firm belief in their own moral worth. As a matter of fact, however, it would seem that although no one is positively certain how good or bad he is, he can hardly deny that he can recollect immoral dreams of his own. That there are such dreams no one denies, the only question is, how do they originate? So that in spite of their conflicting judgments of dream morality, both groups of authors are at pains to explain the genesis of the immoral dream, and here a new conflict arises, as to whether its origin is to be sought in the normal functions of the physic life, or in the somatically conditioned encroachments upon this life. The nature of the facts compel both those who argue for and those who argue against moral responsibility in dream life to agree in recognizing a special psychic source for the immorality of dreams. Those who maintain that morality continues to function in our dream life nevertheless refrain from assuming full responsibility for their dreams. Hafner says, "We are not responsible for our dreams because that basis which alone gives our life truth and reality is withdrawn from our thoughts and our will. Hence the wishes and actions of our dreams cannot be virtuous or sinful. Yet the dreamer is responsible for the sinful dream, in so far as indirectly he brings it about. Thus, as in waking state, it is his duty just before going to sleep, morally to cleanse his mind." The analysis of this admixture of denial and recognition of responsibility for the moral content of dreams is carried much further by Hildebrandt. After arguing that the dramatic method of representation characteristic of his dreams, the condensation of the most complicated processes of reflection into the briefest periods of time, and the debasement and confusion of the imaginative elements of dreams, which even he admits must allow for, in some respect, the immoral appearance of the dreams, he nevertheless confesses that there are the most serious objections to flatly denying all responsibility for the lapses and offenses of which we are guilty in our dreams. If we wish to repudiate very decisively any sort of unjust accusation, and especially one which has reference to our intentions and convictions, we use the expression, "We should never have dreamt of such a thing." By this, it is true, we mean on one hand that we consider the region of the dreams the last and remotest place in which we could be held responsible for our thoughts, because these thoughts are so loosely and incoherently connected with our real being that we can, after all, hardly regard them as our own, but inasmuch as we feel impelled expressly to deny the existence of such thoughts even in this region, we are at the same time indirectly admitting that our justification would not be complete unless it extended even thus far. And I believe that here, although unconsciously, we are speaking the language of truth. No dream action can be imagined whose first beginnings have not in some shape already passed through the mind during our waking hours in the form of wish, desire, or impulse. Concerning this original impulse we must say, the dream has not discovered it, it has only imitated and extended it. It has only elaborated into dramatic form a scrap of historical material which it found already existing within us. It brings to our mind the words of the apostle that he who hates his brother is a murderer. And though, after we wake, being conscious of our moral strength, we may smile at the whole widely elaborated structure of the depraved dream, yet the original material out of which we formed it cannot be laughed away. One feels responsible for the transgressions of one's dreaming self, not for the whole sum of them, but yet for a certain percentage. In short, if we in this sense can hardly be impugned, we understand the words of Christ, that out of the heart come evil thoughts, that we can hardly help being convinced that every sin committed in our dreams brings with it at least a vague minimum of guilt. Thus Hildebrandt finds the source of the immorality of dreams in the germs and hints of evil impulses which pass through our minds during the day as mental temptations, and he does not hesitate to include these immoral elements in the ethical evaluation of the personality. These same thoughts and the same evaluation of these thoughts have, as we know, caused devout and holy men of all ages to lament that they were wicked sinners. It is not uninteresting to consider the attitude of the Inquisition to this problem. In the Tractatus de Officio Sententiam Inquisitis of Thomas Carina, one finds the following passage: "Should anyone utter hearsays in his dreams, the inquisitors shall consider this a reason for investigating his conduct in life, for that which is wont to return in sleep, which occupies a man during the day." Dr. Edinger, St. Urban, Switzerland. The general occurrence of these contrasting thoughts in the majority of men, and even in other regions than the ethical, is of course established beyond a doubt. They have sometimes been judged in a less serious spirit. Spitta quotes a relevant passage from A. Zeller. An intellect is rarely so happily organized as to be in full command of itself at all times and seasons, and never to be disturbed in the lucid and constant processes of thought by ideas not merely unessential, but absolutely grotesque and nonsensical. Indeed, the greatest thinkers have had cause to complain of this dreamlike, tormenting, and distressing ramble of ideas, which disturbs their profoundest contemplations and their most pious and earnest meditations. A clearer light is thrown on the psychological meaning of these contrasting thoughts by a further observation of Hildebrandt's, to the effect that dreams permit us an occasional glimpse of the deepest and innermost recesses of our being, which are generally closed to us in this waking state. A recognition of this fact is betrayed by Kant in his Anthropology, when he states that our dreams may perhaps be intended to reveal to us not what we are, but what we might have been if we had had another upbringing, and by Radstock, who suggests that our dreams disclose to us what we do not wish to admit to ourselves, and that we therefore unjustly condemn them as lying and deceptive. J. E. Erdmann asserts, "A dream has never told me what I ought to think of a person, but, to my great surprise, a dream has more than once taught me what I do really think of him and feel about him." And J. H. Fitch expresses himself in a like manner. The character of our dreams gives a far truer reflection of our general disposition than anything which we can learn by self-observation in the waking state. Such remarks as this of Benini's call attention to the fact that the emergence of impulses which are foreign to our ethical consciousness is merely analogous to the manner already familiar to us in which the dream disposes of other representative material. Volquet expresses himself in a similar fashion. Even ideas which have entered into our consciousness almost unnoticed, and which, perhaps, it has never been before called out of oblivion, often announce their presence in the mind through a dream. Finally, we may remember that, according to Schleiermacher, the state of the falling asleep is accompanied by the appearance of undesired imaginings. We may include in such undesired imaginings the whole of that imaginative material the occurrence of which surprises us in immoral as well as in absurd dreams. The only important difference consists in the fact that the undesired imaginings in the moral sphere as in opposition to our usual feelings, whereas the others merely appear strange to us. So far nothing has been done to enable us to reconcile this difference by a profounder understanding. But what is the significance of the emergence of undesired representations in dreams? What conclusions can the psychology of the waking and dreaming mind draw from these nocturnal manifestations of contrasting ethical impulses? Here we find a fresh diversity of opinion, and also a different grouping of the authors who have treated the subject. The line of thought followed by Hildebrandt, and by others who share his fundamental opinion, cannot be continued otherwise than by ascribing to the immoral impulses, even in the waking state, a latent vitality, which is indeed inhibited from proceeding to action, and by asserting that during sleep something falls away from us, which, having the effect of an inhibition, has kept us from becoming aware of the existence of such impulses. Dreams, therefore, reveal the true, if not the whole, nature of the dreamer, and are one means of making the hidden life of the psyche accessible to our understanding. It is only on such hypotheses that Hildebrandt can attribute to the dream the role of a monitor who calls our attention to the secret mischief in the soul, just as, according to physicians, it may announce a hitherto unobserved physical disorder. Spitta, too, must be influenced by this conception, which he refers, for example, to the stream of excitations which flow in upon the psyche during puberty, and consoles the dreamer by assuring him that he has done all that is in his power if he has led a strictly virtuous life during his waking state, if he has made an attempt to suppress the sinful thoughts as often as they arise, and has kept them from maturing and turning into action. According to this conception, we may designate as undesired imaginings those that are suppressed during the day. We must recognize that in their emergence a genuine psychic phenomenon. According to certain other authors, we have no right to draw this last inference. For Justin, the undesired ideas and images in the dream as in the waking state, and also in the delirium of fever, etc., possess the character of a voluntary activity laid to rest, and of a procession, to some extent mechanical, of images and ideas evoked by inner impulses. An immoral dream proves nothing in respect of the psychic life of the dreamer except that he has somehow become cognizant of the imaginative content in question. It is certainly no proof of a psychic impulse of his own mind. Another writer, Maury, makes us wonder whether he too does not ascribe to the dream state the power of dividing the psychic activity into its components instead of aimlessly destroying it. He speaks as follows of dreams in which one oversteps the bounds of morality. Translation: Our tendencies speak and make us act without being restrained by our conscience, although it sometimes warns us. I have my faults and vicious tendencies. Awake, I try to fight against them, and often enough I do not succumb to them. But in my dreams I always succumb, or rather I act at their direction without fear or remorse. Les Sommeliers, page 113. Evidently the visions which unfold in my dreams, and which constitute the dream, are suggested by the stimuli which I feel, and which my absent will does not try to repel. If one believed in the power of the dream to reveal an actually existing, but suppressed or concealed immoral disposition of the dreamer, one could not express one's opinion more emphatically than in the words of Maury, page 115. Translation: In a dream a man is totally revealed to himself in his naked and wretched state. As he suspends the exercise of his will, he becomes a toy of all the passions from which, when awake, our conscious horror and fear defend us. He then mentions as an example that his own dreams often reveal him as a victim of just those superstitions which he has most vigorously attacked in his writings. The value of all these acute observations is, however, impaired in Maury's case, because he refuses to recognize in the phenomena which he has so accurately observed anything more than proof of the automasme psychologique which, in his own opinion, dominates the dream life. He conceives this automasm as the complete opposite of the psychic activity. A passage in Stricker's Subrin über das Bewusstsein reads, Dreamers do not consist purely and simply of delusions. For example, if one is afraid of robbers in a dream, the robbers indeed are imaginary, but the fear is real. Our attention is here called to the fact that the effective development of a dream does not admit of the judgment which one bestows upon the rest of the dream content, and the problem then arises: what part of the psychic processes in a dream may be real? That is to say, what part of them may claim to be enrolled among the psychic processes of the waking state. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Malone. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Chapter 1, Section G. Dream Theories and the Function of the Dream. A statement concerning the dream which seeks to explain as many as possible of its observed characteristics from a single point of view, and which at the same time defines the relation of the dream to a more comprehensive sphere of phenomena, may be described as a theory of the dream. The individual theories of the dream will be distinguished from one another by their designating as essential this or that characteristic of dreams, and relating thereto their data and their explanations. It is not absolutely necessary that we should deduce from the theory of the dream a function, that is, a use or any such similar role, but expectation, being as a matter of habit, teleologically inclined, will nevertheless welcome these theories, which afford us some insight into a function of dreams. We have already become acquainted with many conceptions of the dream, which in this sense are more or less deserving of the name of dream theories. The belief of the ancients that dreams were sent by the gods in order to guide the actions of man was a complete theory of the dream, which told them all that was worth knowing about dreams. Since dreams have become an object of biological research, we have a greater number of theories, some of which, however, are very incomplete. Provided we make no claim to completeness, we might venture on the following rough grouping of dream theories, based on their fundamental conception of the degree and mode of the psychic activity in dreams. 1. Theories like those of Delboeuf, which allow the full psychic activity of the waking state to continue in our dreams. Here the psyche does not sleep. Its apparatus remains intact, but under the conditions of the sleeping state, which differ from those of the waking state. It must, in its normal functioning, give results which differ from those of the waking state. As regards these theories, it may be questioned whether their authors are in a position to derive the distinction between dreaming and waking thought entirely from the conditions of the sleeping state. Moreover, they lack one possible access to a function of dreams. One does not understand to what purpose one dreams, why the complicated mechanism of the psychic apparatus should continue to operate even when it is placed under conditions to which it does not appear to be adapted. There are only two purposeful reactions in the place of the reaction of dreaming: to sleep dreamlessly, or to wake when affected by disturbing stimuli. 2. Theories which, on the contrary, assume for the dream a diminution of the psychic activity, a loosening of connections, and an impoverishment of the available material. In accordance with these theories, one must assume for sleep a psychological character entirely different from that given by Delboeuf. Sleep encroaches widely upon the psyche. It does not consist in the mere shutting it off from the outer world. On the contrary, it enters into its mechanism and makes it for the time being unserviceable. If I may draw a comparison from psychiatry, I would say that the first group of theories construes the dream like a paranoia, while the second represents it as a type of mental deficiency or amentia. The theory that only a fragment of the psychic activity paralyzed by sleep finds expression in dreams is that by far the most favored by medical writers and by scientists in general. In so far as one may presuppose a general interest in dream interpretation, one may indeed describe it as the most popular theory of dreams. It is remarkable how nimbly this particular theory avoids the greatest danger that threatens every dream interpretation, that is, shipwreck on one of the contrasts incorporated in dreams. Since this theory regards dreams as the result of a partial waking, or as Herbert puts it in his Psychologie über den Traum, a gradual, partial, and at the same time very anomalous waking, it is able to cover the whole series from the inferior activities of dreams, which betray themselves by their absurdity, to fully concentrated intellectual activity, by a series of states of progressive awakening, ending in complete wakefulness. Those who find the psychological mode of expression indispensable, or who deem it more scientific, will find this theory of dreams summarized in Binz's description, page 43. The state of torpor, however, gradually comes to an end in the hours of early morning. The accumulated products of fatigue in the albumen of the brain gradually diminish. They are slowly decomposed or carried away by the constantly flowing bloodstream. Here and there, individual groups of cells can be distinguished as being awake, while around them all is still in a state of torpidity. The isolated work of the individual groups now appears before our clouded consciousness, which is still powerless to control other parts of the brain, which govern the associations. Hence the pictures created, which for the most part correspond to the objective impressions of the immediate past, combine with one another in a wild and uncontrolled fashion. As the number of brain cells set free constantly increases, the irrationality of the dream becomes constantly less. The conception of the dream as an incomplete partial waking state, or traces of the influence of this conception, will of course be found in the works of all the modern psychologists and philosophers. It is most completely represented by Maury. It often seems as though this author conceives the state of being awake or asleep as susceptible of shifting from one anatomical region to another, each anatomical region seeming to him to be connected with a definite psychic function. Here I will merely suggest that even if the theory of partial waking were confirmed, its finer superstructure would still call for exhaustive consideration. No function of dreams, of course, can emerge from this conception of the dream life. On the contrary, Binz, one of the chief proponents of this theory, consistently enough denies that dreams have any status or importance. He says, page 357, "All the facts, as we see them, urge us to characterize the dreams as a physical process, in all cases useless, and in many cases definitely morbid." The expression physical in reference to dreams, the word is emphasized by the author, points, of course, in more than one direction. In the first place, it refers to the etiology of dreams, which was of special interest to Binz, as he was studying the experimental production of dreams by the administration of drugs. It is certainly in keeping with this kind of dream theory to ascribe the incitement to dreaming, whenever possible, exclusively to somatic origins. Presented in the most extreme form, the theory is as follows. After we have put ourselves to sleep by the banishment of stimuli, there would be no need to dream, and no reason for dreaming, until the morning, when the gradual awakening through the fresh invasion of stimuli might be reflected in the phenomenon of dreaming. But, as a matter of fact, it is not possible to protect our sleep from stimuli. Like the germs of life which Mephistopheles complained, stimuli come to the sleeper from all directions, from without, from within, and even from all those bodily regions which never trouble us during the waking state. Thus our sleep is disturbed, now this, now that little corner of the psyche is jogged into the waking state, and the psyche functions for a while with the awakened fraction, yet is thankful to fall asleep again. The dream is the reaction to the disturbance of sleep caused by the stimulus, but it is, when all is said, a purely superfluous reaction. The description of the dream, which after all remains an activity of the psychic organ, as a physical process, has yet another connotation. So to describe it is to deny that the dream has the dignity of a psychic process. The old simile of the 10 fingers of a person ignorant of music running over the keyboard of an instrument perhaps best illustrates in what esteem the dream is commonly held by the representatives of exact science. Thus conceived, it becomes something wholly insusceptible of interpretation. How could the 10 fingers of a player ignorant of music perform a musical composition? The theory of partial wakefulness did not escape criticism even by the earlier writers. Thus Burdick wrote in 1830, "If we say that dreaming is a partial waking, then, in the first place, neither the waking nor the sleeping state is explained thereby. Secondly, this amounts only to saying that certain powers of the mind are active in dreams, while others are at rest. But such irregularities occur throughout life." Page 482. The prevailing dream theory, which conceives the dream as a physical process, finds a certain support in a very interesting conception of the dream, which was first propounded by Robert in 1866, and which is seductive because it assigns to the dream a function or a useful result. As the basis of his theory, Robert takes 2 objectively observable facts, which we have already discussed in our consideration of dream material, Chapter 1b. These facts are: 1. That one very often dreams about the most insignificant impressions of the day, and 2. That one rarely carries over into the dream the absorbing interests of the day. Robert asserts as an indisputable fact that those matters which have been fully settled and solved never evoke dreams, but only such as lie incompleted in the mind, or touch it merely in passing, page 10. For this reason we cannot usually explain our dreams, since their causes are to be found in sensory impressions of the preceding day which have not attained sufficient recognition on the part of the dreamer. The condition permitting an impression to reach the dream is, therefore, that this impression has been disturbed in its elaboration, or that it was too insignificant to lay claim to such elaboration. Robert, therefore, conceives the dream as a physical process of elimination, which in its psychic reaction reaches the consciousness. Dreams are eliminations of thoughts, nipped in the bud. A man deprived of the capacity for dreaming would in time become mentally unbalanced, because an immense number of unfinished and unsolved thoughts and superficial impressions would accumulate in his brain, under the pressure of which all that should be incorporated in the memory as a completed whole would be stifled. The dream acts as a safety valve for the overburdened brain. Dreams possess a healing and unburdening power, page 32. We should misunderstand Robert if we were to ask him how representation in the dream could bring about an unburdening of the mind. The writer apparently concluded from these 2 peculiarities of the dream material that during sleep such an elimination of worthless impressions is effected somehow as a somatic process, and that dreaming is not a special psychic process, but only the information which we receive of such elimination. Moreover, elimination is not the only thing that takes place in the mind during sleep. Robert himself adds that the stimuli of the day are likewise elaborated, and what cannot be eliminated from the undigested thought material lying in the mind is bound up into a completed whole by mental clues borrowed from the imagination, and is thus enrolled in the memory as a harmless fantasy picture. Page 23. But it is in his criticism of the sources of dreams that Robert is most flatly opposed to the prevailing theory. Whereas, according to this theory, there would be no dream if the external and internal sensory stimuli did not repeatedly wake the mind. According to Robert, the impulse to dream lies in the mind itself. It lies in the overloading of the mind, which demands discharge, and Robert considers, quite consistently, that those causes conditioning the dream which depend on the physical condition assume a subordinate rank, and could not incite dreams in a mind which contained no material for dream formation derived from the waking consciousness. It is admitted, however, that the fantasy images originating in the depths of the mind may be influenced by nervous stimuli, page 48. Thus, according to Robert, dreams are not, after all, wholly dependent on the somatic element. Dreaming is, of course, not a psychic process, and it has no place among the psychic processes of the waking state. It is a nocturnal somatic process in the apparatus of mental activity, and has a function to perform, namely, to guard this apparatus against excessive strain, or, if we may be allowed to change the comparison, to cleanse the mind. Another author, Yves Delage, bases his theory on the same characteristics of the dream characteristics which are perceptible in the selection of the dream material, and it is instructive to observe how a trifling twist in the conception of the same things gives a final result entirely different in its bearings. Delage, having lost through death a person very dear to him, found that we either do not dream at all of what occupies us intently during the day, or that we begin to dream of it only after it is overshadowed by the other interests of the day. His investigations in respect of other persons corroborated the universality of this state of affairs. Concerning the dreams of newly married people, he makes a comment which is admirable if it should prove to be generally true. S'ils ont été fortement épris, presque jamais ils n'ont rêvé l'un de l'autre avant le mariage ou pendant la lune de miel, et s'ils ont rêvé d'amour, c'est pour être infidèles avec quelque personne indifférente ou odieuse. But of what does one dream? Delage recognizes that the material of our dreams consists of fragments and remnants of impressions, both from the last few days and from earlier periods. All that appears in our dreams, all that we may at first be inclined to consider the creation of dream life, proves, on closer investigation, to be unrecognized reproduction, souvenir inconscient. But this representative material reveals one common characteristic. It originates from impressions which have probably affected our senses more forcibly than our mind, or from which the attention has been deflected soon after their occurrence. The less conscious, and at the same time the stronger an impression, the greater the prospect of its playing a part in our next dream. If they are very much in love, they have almost never dreamed of each other before the marriage or during the honeymoon, and if they have dreamed of love, it was to be unfaithful with someone unimportant or distasteful. These two categories of impressions, the insignificant and the undisposed of, are essentially the same as those which were emphasized by Robert, but Delage gives them another significance, inasmuch as he believes that these impressions are capable of exciting dreams not because they are indifferent, but because they are not disposed of. The insignificant impressions also are, in a sense, not fully disposed of. They, too, owing to their character of new impressions, are autant de ressorts tendus, which will be relaxed during sleep. Still more entitled to a role in the dream than a weak and almost unnoticed impression is a vivid impression which has been accidentally retarded in its elaboration, or unintentionally repressed. The psychic energy accumulated during the day by inhibition or suppression becomes the mainspring of the dream at night. In dreams, psychically suppressed material achieves expression. So many taut lines. 2. A novelist, Anatole France, expresses himself to a similar effect, le lys rouge. Ce que nous voyons la nuit, ce sont les restes malheureux que nous avons négligés pendant la veille. Le rêve est souvent la revanche des choses qu'on méprise ou que le reproche des autres abandonne. What we see at night are the unhappy relics that we neglected while awake. The dream is often the revenge of things scorned, or the reproach of beings deserted. Unfortunately, Delage does not pursue this line of thought any further. He is able to ascribe only the most insignificant role in our dreams to an independent psychic activity, and thus, in his theory of dreams, he reverts to the prevailing doctrine of a partial slumber of the brain. En somme, le rêve est le produit de la pensée errante, sans but et sans direction, se fixant successivement sur les souvenirs qui ont gardé assez d'intensité pour se placer sur sa route, et l'arrêter au passage, établissant entre eux un lien tantôt faible et indécis, tantôt plus fort et plus serré, selon que l'activité actuelle du cerveau est plus ou moins abolie par le sommeil. In short, the dream is the product of wandering thought, without end or direction, successively fixing on memories which have retained sufficient intensity to put themselves in the way and block the passage, establishing between themselves a connection sometimes weak and loose, sometimes stronger and closer, according to whether the actual work of the brain is more or less suppressed by sleep. 3. In a third group, we may include those dream theories which ascribe to the dreaming mind the capacity for and propensity to special psychic activities, which in the waking state it is able to exert either not at all or imperfectly. In most cases, the manifestation of these activities is held to result in a useful function of dreams. The evaluations of dreams by the earlier psychologists fall chiefly within this category. I shall content myself, however, with quoting in their stead the assertion of Burdick, to the effect that dreaming is the natural activity of the mind, which is not limited by the power of the individuality, nor disturbed by self-consciousness, nor directed by self-determination, but is the vitality of the sensible focus indulging in free play. Page 486. Burdick and others evidently consider this reveling in the free use of its own powers as a state in which the mind refreshes itself and gathers fresh strength for the day's work, something indeed after the fashion of a vacation. Burdick therefore cites with approval the admirable words in which the poet Novalis lauds the power of the dream. The dream is a bulwark against the regularity and commonplace character of life, a free recreation of the fettered fantasy, in which it intermingles all the images of life and interrupts the constant seriousness of the adult by the joyful play of the child. Without the dream we should surely grow old earlier, so that the dream may be considered, if not precisely as a gift from above, yet as a delightful exercise, a friendly companion on our pilgrimage to the grave. The refreshing and healing activity of dreams is even more impressively described by Purkinje, page 456. The productive dreams, in particular, would perform these functions. They are the unconstrained play of the imagination, and have no connection with the events of the day. The mind is loath to continue the tension of the waking life, but wishes to relax it and recuperate from it. It creates, in the first place, conditions opposed to those of the waking state. It cures sadness by joy, worry by hope, and cheerfully distracting images, hatred by love, and friendliness and fear by courage and confidence. It appeases doubt by conviction and firm belief, and vain expectation by realization. Sleep heals many sore spots in the mind, which the day keeps continually open, by covering them and guarding them against fresh irritation. On this depends in some degree the consoling action of time. We all feel that sleep is beneficial to the psychic life, and the vague surmise of the popular consciousness is apparently loath to surrender the notion that dreaming is one of the ways in which sleep bestows its benefits. The most original and most comprehensive attempt to explain dreaming as a special activity of the mind, which can freely unfold itself only in the sleeping state, is that made by Scherner in 1861. Scherner's book is written in a heavy and bombastic style, and is inspired by an almost intoxicated enthusiasm for the subject, which is bound to repel us unless it can carry us away with it. It places so many difficulties in the way of an analysis that we gladly resort to the clearer and conciser presentation of Scherner's theories made by the philosopher Foucault. From these mystical conglomerations, from all these outbursts of splendor and radiance, there indeed flashes and shines an ominous semblance of meaning, but the path of the philosopher is not illumined thereby. Such is the criticism of Scherner's exposition by one of his own followers. Scherner is not one of those writers for whom the mind carries its undiminished faculties into the dream life. He even explains how, in our dreams, the centrality and spontaneous energy of the ego become enervated, how cognition, feeling, will, and imagination are transformed by this decentralization, how the remnant of these psychic forces has not a truly intellectual character, but is rather of the nature of a mechanism. But, on the other hand, that activity of the psyche which may be described as fantasy, freed from all rational governance, and hence no longer strictly controlled, rises to absolute supremacy in our dreams. To be sure, it borrows all its building material from the memory of the waking state, but with this material It builds up structures which differ from those of the waking state, as day differs from night. In our dreams, it reveals itself as not only reproductive but also productive. Its peculiarities give the dream life its singular character. It shows a preference for the unlimited, the exaggerated, the prodigious, but by its liberation from the inhibiting categories of thought, it gains a greater flexibility and agility, and indulges in pleasurable turns. It is excessively sensitive to the delicate emotional stimuli of the mind, to its stirring and disturbing effects, and it rapidly recasts the inner life into an external plastic visibility. The dream fantasy lacks the language of concepts. What it wishes to say, it must express in visible form, and since in this case the concept does not exert an inhibitory control, it depicts it in all the fullness, power, and breadth of visible form. But hereby its language, plain though it is, becomes cumbersome, awkward, and prolix. Plain speaking is rendered especially difficult by the fact that it dislikes expressing an object by its actual image, but prefers to select an alien image, if only the latter is able to express that particular aspect of the object which it is anxious to represent. Such is the symbolizing activity of the fantasy. It is, moreover, very significant that the dream fantasy reproduces objects not in detail, but only in outline, and in the freest possible manner. Its paintings, therefore, are like light and brilliant sketches. The dream fantasy, however, does not stop at the mere representation of the object, but feels an internal urge to implicate the dream ego to some extent with the object, and thus to give rise to action. The visual dream, for example, depicts gold coins lying in the street. The dreamer picks them up, rejoices, and carries them away. According to Schörner, the material upon which the dream fantasy exerts its artistic activity consists preponderantly of the organic sensory stimuli, which are so obscure during the day. Compare page 151 above. Hence it is that the over-fantastic theory of Schörner, and perhaps two matter-of-fact theories of Wundt and other psychologists, though otherwise diametrically opposed to each other, are in perfect agreement in their assumptions with regard to dream sources and dream stimuli. But whereas, according to the psychological theory, the psychic reaction to the inner physical stimuli becomes exhausted with the arousing of any of the ideas appropriate to these stimuli, as these ideas then, by way of association, call to their aid other ideas, so that on reaching this stage the chain of psychic processes appears to terminate. According to Schörner, on the other hand, the physical stimuli merely supply the psyche with material which it may utilize in fulfilling its fantastic intentions. For Schörner, dream formation begins where, according to the views of other writers, it comes to an end. What the dream fantasy does with the physical stimuli cannot, of course, be regarded as purposeful. The fantasy plays a tantalizing game with them, and represents the organic source of the stimuli of the dream in question by any sort of plastic symbolism. Indeed, Schörner holds, though here Foucault and others differ from him, that the dream fantasy has a certain favorite symbol for the organism as a whole, namely the house. Fortunately, however, for its representations, it does not seem to limit itself to this material. It may also employ a whole series of houses to designate a single organ, For example, very long streets of houses for the intestinal stimulus. In other dreams, particular parts of the house may actually represent particular regions of the body, as in the headache dream, when the ceiling of the room, which the dream sees covered with disgusting toad-like spiders, represents the head. Quite apart from the symbol of the house, any other suitable object may be employed to represent those parts of the body which excite the dream. Thus, the breathing lungs find their symbol in the flaming stove with its windy roaring, the heart in the hollow chests and baskets, the bladder in round, ball-shaped or simply hollow objects. The man's dreams, when due to the sexual stimulus, make the dreamer find in the street the upper portion of a clarinet, or the mouthpiece of a tobacco pipe, or again a piece of fur. The clarinet and tobacco pipe represent the approximate form of the male's sexual organ, while the fur represents the pubic hair. In the sexual dreams of the female, the tightness of the closed thighs may be symbolized by a narrow courtyard surrounded by houses, and the vagina by a very narrow, slippery, and soft footpath leading through the courtyard, upon which the dreamer is obliged to walk, in order perhaps to carry a letter to a man. Folkelt, page 39. It is particularly noteworthy that at the end of such a physically stimulated dream, the fantasy, as it were, unmasks itself by representing the exciting organ or its function unconcealed. Thus, the tooth-excited dream usually ends with the dreamer taking a tooth out of his mouth. The dream fantasy may, however, direct its attention not merely to the form of the exciting organ, but may even make the substance contained therein the subject of symbolization. Thus, for example, the dream excited by the intestinal stimuli may lead us through muddy streets, the dream due to stimuli from the bladder to foaming water, or the stimulus as such, the nature of its excitation, and the object which it covets, are represented symbolically, or again, the dream ego enters into a concrete association with the symbolization of its own state, as, for example, when, in the case of painful stimuli, we struggle desperately with vicious dogs or raging bulls, or when, in a sexual dream, the dreamer sees herself pursued by a naked man. Disregarding all the possible prolixity of elaboration, a fantastic symbolizing activity remains as the central force of every dream. Folkelt, in his fine and enthusiastic essay, attempted to penetrate still further into the character of this fantasy, and to assign to the psychic activity thus recognized its position in a system of philosophical ideas, which, however, remains altogether too difficult of comprehension for anyone who is not prepared by previous training for the intuitive comprehension of philosophical modes of thought. Schörner attributes no useful function to the activity of the symbolizing fantasy in dreams. In dreams, the psyche plays with the stimuli which are offered to it. One might conjecture that it plays in a mischievous fashion, and we might be asked whether our detailed consideration of Schörner's dream theory, the arbitrariness of which and its deviation from the rules of all forms of research are only too obvious, can lead to any useful results. We might fitly reply that to reject Schörner's theory without previous examination would be imposing too arrogant a veto. This theory is based on the impressions produced by his dreams on a man who paid close attention to them, and who would appear to be personally very well equipped for tracing obscure psychic phenomena. Furthermore, it treats of a subject which, though rich in its contents and relations, has for thousands of years appeared mysterious to humanity, and to the elucidation of which science, strictly so called, has, as it confesses, contributed nothing beyond attempting, in uncompromising opposition to popular sentiment, to deny its content and significance. Finally, let us frankly admit that it seems as though we cannot very well avoid the fantastical in our attempts to explain dreams. We must remember also that there is such a thing as a fantasy of ganglion cells. The passage cited, page 87, from a sober and exact investigator like Binns, who describes how the dawn of awakening floods the dormant cell masses of the cerebral cortex, is not a whit less fanciful and improbable than Schörner's attempts at interpretation. I hope to be able to demonstrate that there is something real underlying these attempts, though the phenomena which he describes have been only vaguely recognized, and do not possess the character of universality that should entitle them to be the basis of a theory of dreams. For the present, Schörner's theory of dreams, in contrast to the medical theory, may perhaps lead us to realize between what extremes the explanation of dream life is still unsteadily vacillating. End of section 8. Reading by Malone.
Section 9 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. Chapter 1, Section H. The relation between dreams and mental diseases. When we speak of the relation of dreams to mental derangement, we may mean three different things. 1. Etiological and clinical relations, as when a dream represents or initiates a psychotic condition, or occurs subsequently to such a condition. 2. Changes which the dream life undergoes in cases of mental disease. 3. Inner relations between dreams and psychoses, analogies which point to an intimate relationship. These manifold relations between the two series of phenomena were in the early days of medical science, and are once more at the present time, a favorite theme of medical writers, as we may learn from the literature on the subject collated by Spitta, Redestock, Maury, and Tissey. Recently, Sante de Sanctis has directed his attention to this relationship. For the purposes of our discussion, it will suffice merely to glance at this important subject. As to the clinical and etiological relations between dreams and the psychoses, I will report the following observations as examples. Hohenbaum asserts that the first attack of insanity is frequently connected with a terrifying anxiety dream, and that the predominating idea is related to this dream. Sante de Sanctis adduces similar observations in respect of paranoiacs, and declares them to be, in some of them, le vrai cause déterminante de la folie, translated, the real determining cause of the madness. The psychosis may come to life quite suddenly, simultaneously with the dream that contains its effective and delusional explanation. Or it may develop slowly through subsequent dreams that have still to struggle against doubt. In one of de Sanctis's cases, an intensively moving dream was accompanied by slight hysterical attacks, which in their turn were followed by an anxious, melancholic state. Fair refers to a dream which was followed by hysterical paralysis. Here the dream is presented as the etiology of mental derangement, although we should be making a statement equally consistent with the facts were we to say that the first manifestation of the mental derangement occurred in the dream life. that the disorder first broke through in the dream. In other instances, the morbid symptoms are included in the dream life, or the psychosis remains confined to the dream life. Thus, Thaumayer calls our attention to anxiety dreams, which must be conceived as the equivalent of epileptic attacks. Allison has described cases of nocturnal insanity in which the subjects are apparently perfectly well in the daytime, while hallucinations, fits of frenzy, and the like regularly make their appearance at night. De Sanctis and Tissy record similar observations, the equivalent of a paranoid dream in an alcoholic, voices accusing a wife of infidelity. Tissy records many observations of recent date in which behavior of a pathological character, based on delusory hypotheses, obsessive impulses, had their origin in dreams. Gerslein describes a case in which sleep was replaced by an intermittent insanity. We cannot doubt that one day the physician will concern himself not only with the psychology, but also with the psychopathology of dreams. In cases of convalescence from insanity, it is often especially obvious that while the functions may be healthy by day, the dream life may still partake of the psychosis. Gregory is said to have been the first to call attention to such cases. Macario gives an account of a maniac who, a week after his complete recovery, once more experienced in dreams the flux of ideas and the unbridled impulses of his disease. Concerning the changes which the dream life undergoes in chronic psychotics, little research has been undertaken as yet. On the other hand, early attention was given to the inner relationship between dreams and mental disturbances, a relationship which is demonstrated by the complete agreement of the manifestations occurring in each. According to Maury, Cabinets, in his Report du physique et du moral, was the first to call attention to this relationship. He was followed by Lelut, G. Moreau, and more particularly the philosopher Maine de Biran. The comparison between the two is of course older still. Redistock begins the chapter in which he deals with the subject by citing a number of opinions which insist on the analogy between insanity and dreaming. Kant says somewhere, "The lunatic is a dreamer in the waking state." According to Krauss, insanity is a dream in which the senses are awake. Schopenhauer terms the dream a brief insanity and insanity a long dream. Hagen describes delirium as a dream life which is induced not by sleep but by disease. Wundt in his Physiologische Psychologie declares, "As a matter of fact, we ourselves may in dreams experience almost all the manifestations which we observe in the asylums for the insane." The specific points of agreement, in consequence of which such a comparison commends itself to our judgment, are enumerated by Spitta, who groups them, very much as Maury has done, as follows. 1. Suspension, or at least retardation of self-consciousness, and consequently ignorance of the condition as such, the impossibility of astonishment, and a lack of moral consciousness. 2. Modified perception of the sensory organs. That is, perception is, as a rule, diminished in dreams, and greatly enhanced in insanity. 3. Mutual combination of ideas, exclusively in accordance with the laws of association and reproduction, hence automatic series formations. Hence again the lack of proportion in the relations between ideas, exaggerations, phantasms. And the result of all this? 4. Changes in, for example, inversions of, the personality, and sometimes of the idiosyncrasies of the character, perversities. Redistock adds a few additional data concerning the analogous nature of the material of dreams and of mental derangement. The greatest number of hallucinations and illusions are found in the sphere of the senses of sight and hearing and general sensation. As in dreams, the fewest elements are supplied by the senses of smell and taste. The fever patient, like the dreamer, is assailed by reminiscences from the remote past. What the waking and healthy man seems to have forgotten is recollected in sleep and in disease. The analogy between dreams and the psychoses receives its full value only when, like a family resemblance, It is extended to the subtler points of mimicry and even the individual peculiarities of facial expression. To him who is tortured by physical and mental sufferings, the dream accords what has been denied him by reality, to wit, physical well-being and happiness. So too the insane see radiant images of happiness, eminence, and wealth. The supposed possession of estates and the imaginary fulfillment of wishes, the denial or destruction of which have actually been a psychic cause of the insanity, often form the main content of the delirium. The woman who has lost a dearly beloved child experiences in her delirium the joys of maternity. The man who has suffered reverses of fortune deems himself immensely wealthy, and the jilted girl sees herself tenderly beloved. The passage from Ratastock is an abstract of a brilliant exposition of Greisinger's, which reveals with the greatest clarity wish fulfillment as a characteristic of the imagination common to dreams and to the psychoses. My own investigations have taught me that here is to be found the key to a psychological theory of dreams and of the psychoses. Absurd combinations of ideas and weakness of judgment are the main characteristics of the dream and of insanity. The overestimation of one's own mental capacity, which appears absurd to sober judgment, is found alike in both, and the rapid flux of imaginings in the dream corresponds to the flux of ideas in the psychoses. Both are devoid of any measure of time. The splitting of the personality in dreams, which, for instance, distributes one's own knowledge between two persons, one of whom, the strange person, corrects one's own ego in the dream, entirely corresponds with the well-known splitting of the personality in hallucinatory paranoia. The dreamer, too, hears his own thoughts expressed by strange voices. Even the constant delusive ideas find their analogy in the stereotyped and recurring pathological dream. After recovering from delirium, patients not infrequently declare that the whole period of their illness appeared to them like an uncomfortable dream. Indeed, they inform us that sometimes during their illness they have suspected that they were only dreaming, just as often happens in the sleep dream. In view of all this, it is not surprising that Ratastock should summarize his own opinion and that of many others in the following words: "Insanity, an abnormal, morbid phenomenon, is to be regarded as an enhancement of the periodically recurring normal dream state." Krauss attempted to base the relationship between the dream and insanity upon their etiology, or rather upon the sources of excitation, thus perhaps making the relationship even more intimate than was possible on the basis of the analogous nature of the phenomena manifested. According to him, the fundamental element common to both is, as we've already learned, the organically conditioned sensation, the sensation of physical stimuli, the general sensation arising out of contributions from all the organs. The undeniable agreement between dreams and mental derangement, extending even to characteristic details, constitutes one of the strongest confirmations of the medical theory of dream life, according to which the dream is represented as a useless and disturbing process, and as the expression of a diminished psychic activity. One cannot expect, for the present, to derive the final explanation of the dream from the psychic derangements, since, as is well known, our understanding of the origin of the latter is still highly unsatisfactory. It is very probable, however, that a modified conception of the dream must also influence our views regarding the inner mechanism of mental disorders, and hence we may say that we are working towards the explanation of the psychoses when we endeavor to elucidate the mystery of dreams. Addendum 1909. I shall have to justify myself for not extending my summary of the literature of dream problems to cover the period between the first appearance of this book and the publication of the second edition. This justification may not seem very satisfactory to the reader. Nonetheless, to me it was decisive. The motives which induced me to summarize the treatment of dreams in the literature of the subject have been exhausted by the foregoing introduction. To have continued this would have cost me a great deal of effort, and would not have been particularly useful or instructive. for the interval in question, a period of 9 years, has yielded nothing new or valuable as regards the conception of dreams, either in actual material or in novel points of view. In most of the literature which has appeared since the publication of my own work, the latter has not been mentioned or discussed. It has, of course, received the least attention from the so-called research workers on dreams, who have thus afforded a brilliant example of the aversion to learning anything new so characteristic of the scientist. Les savants ne sont pas curieux. Translated, the learned are not inquisitive, said the scoffer Anatole France. If there were such a thing in science as the right of revenge, I, in my turn, should be justified in ignoring the literature which has appeared since the publication of this book. The few reviews which have appeared in the scientific journals are so full of misconceptions and lack of comprehension that my only possible answer to my critics would be a request that they should read this book over again, or perhaps merely that they should read it. In the works of those physicians who make use of the psychoanalytic method of treatment, a great many dreams have been recorded and interpreted in accordance with my directions. Insofar as these works go beyond the confirmation of my own assertions, I have noted their results in the context of my exposition. A supplementary bibliography at the end of this volume comprises the most important of these new publications. The comprehensive work on the dream by Sante de Sanctis, of which a German translation appeared soon after its publication, was produced simultaneously with my own, so that I could not review his results, nor could he comment upon mine. I am sorry to have to express the opinion that this laborious work is exceedingly poor in ideas, so poor that one could never divine from it the possibility of the problems which I have treated in these pages. I can think of only 2 publications which touch on my own treatment of the dream problems. A young philosopher, H. Svoboda, who has ventured to extend W. Fleiss's discovery of biological periodicity in series of 23 and 28 days to the psychic field, has produced an imaginative essay in which, among other things, he has used this key to solve the riddle of dreams. Such a solution, however, would be an inadequate estimate of the significance of dreams. The material content of dreams would be explained by the coincidence of all those memories which, on the night of the dream, complete one of these biological periods for the first or the nth time. A personal communication of the author's led me to assume that he himself no longer took this theory very seriously, but it seems that I was mistaken in this conclusion. I shall record in another place some observations made with reference to Svoboda's thesis, which did not, however, yield convincing results. It gave me far greater pleasure to find by chance, in an unexpected quarter, a conception of the dream which is in complete agreement with the essence of my own. The relevant dates preclude the possibility that this conception was influenced by reading my book. I must therefore hail this as the only demonstrable concurrence with the essentials of my theory of dreams to be found in the literature of the subject. The book which contains the passage that I have in mind was published in its 2nd edition in 1910 by Linnaeus under the title Phantasien eines Realisten. Addendum 1914. The above apologia was written in 1909. Since then, the state of affairs has certainly undergone a change. My contribution to the interpretation of dreams is no longer ignored in the literature of the subject, but the new situation makes it even more impossible to continue the foregoing summary. The interpretation of dreams has evoked a whole series of new contentions and problems, which have been expounded by the authors in the most varied fashions. But I cannot discuss these works until I have developed the theories to which their authors have referred. Whatever has appeared to me as valuable in this recent literature, I have accordingly reviewed in the course of the following exposition. End of Chapter 1, Section H of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill, Chapter 1, Section H. Section 10 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Westra. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. Section 10. The Method of Dream Interpretation. The epigraph on the title page of this volume indicates the tradition to which I prefer to ally myself in the conception of the dream. I am proposing to show that dreams are capable of interpretation, and any contributions to the solution of the problems which have already been discussed will emerge only as possible byproducts in the accomplishment of my special task. On the hypothesis that dreams are susceptible of interpretation, I at once find myself in disagreement with the prevailing doctrine of dreams. In fact, with all the theories of dreams, excepting only that of Scherner. For to interpret a dream is to specify its meaning, to replace it by something which takes its position in the concatenation of our psychic activities as a link of definite importance and value. But as we have seen, the scientific theories of the dream leave no room for a problem of dream interpretation, since, in the first place, according to these theories, dreaming is not a psychic activity at all, but a somatic process which makes itself known to the psychic apparatus by means of symbols. Lay opinion has always been opposed to these theories. It asserts its privilege of proceeding logically, and although it admits that dreams are incomprehensible and absurd, it cannot summon up the courage to deny that dreams have any significance. Led by a dim intuition, it seems rather to assume that dreams have a meaning, albeit a hidden one, that they are intended as a substitute for some other thought process, and that we have only to disclose this substitute correctly in order to discover the hidden meaning of the dream. The unscientific world, therefore, has always endeavored to interpret dreams, and by applying one or the other of two essential different methods. The first of these methods envisages the dream content as a whole, and seeks to replace it by another content which is intelligible and in certain respects analogous. This is symbolic dream interpretation, and of course it goes to pieces at the very outset in the case of those dreams which are not only unintelligible but confused. The construction which the biblical Joseph placed upon the dream of Pharaoh furnishes an example of this method. The 7 fat kine, after which came 7 lean ones that devoured the former, were a symbolic substitute for 7 years of famine in the land of Egypt, which according to the prediction were to consume all the surplus that 7 fruitful years had produced. Much of the artificial dreams contrived by the poets are intended for some such symbolic interpretation, for they reproduce the thought conceived by the poet in a guise not unlike the disguise which we are wont to find in our dreams. A demonstration of the manner in which one arrives at such a symbolic interpretation cannot, of course, be given. Success remains a matter of ingenious conjecture, of direct intuition, and for this reason dream interpretation has naturally been elevated into an art which seems to depend upon extraordinary gifts. Aristotle expressed himself in this connection by saying that the best interpreter of dreams is he who can best grasp similarities. For dream pictures, like pictures in water, are disfigured by the motion of the water, so that he hits the target best who is able to recognize the true picture in the distorted one. The second of the two popular methods of dream interpretation entirely abandons such claims. It might be described as the cipher method, since it treats the dream as a kind of secret code in which every sign is translated into another sign of known meaning, according to an established key. For example, I've dreamt of a letter, and also of a funeral or the like. I consult a dream book, and I find that letter is to be translated by vexation, and funeral by engagement. It now remains to establish a connection, which I am again to assume as pertaining to the future, by means of the rigmarole which I have deciphered. An interesting variant of this cipher procedure, a variant in which its character of purely mechanical transference is to a certain extent corrected, is presented in the work on dream interpretation by Artemidorus of Daldis. Here, not only the dream content, but also the personality and social position of the dreamer are taken into consideration, so that the same dream content has a significance for the rich man, the married man, or the orator, which is different from that which applies to the poor man, the bachelor, or, let us say, the merchant. The essential point, then, in this procedure is that the work of interpretation is not applied to the entirety of the dream, but to each portion of the dream content severally, as though the dream were a conglomerate in which each fragment calls for special treatment. Incoherent and confused dreams are certainly those that have been responsible for the invention of the cipher method. The worthlessness of both these popular methods of interpretation does not admit of discussion. As regards the scientific treatment of the subject, the symbolic method is limited in its application and is not susceptible of a general exposition. In the cipher method, everything depends upon whether the key, the dream book, is reliable, and for that all guarantees are lacking, so that one might be tempted to grant the contention of the philosophers and psychiatrists and to dismiss the problem of dream interpretation as altogether fanciful. After the completion of my manuscript, a paper by Stumpf came to my notice, which agrees with my work in attempting to prove that the dream is full of meaning and capable of interpretation. But the interpretation is undertaken by means of an allegorizing symbolism, and there is no guarantee that the procedure is generally applicable. I have, however, come to think differently. I have been forced to perceive that here, once more, we have one of those not infrequent cases where an ancient and stubbornly retained popular belief seems to have come nearer to the truth of the matter than the opinion of modern science. I must insist that the dream actually does possess a meaning, and that a scientific method of dream interpretation is possible. I've arrived at my knowledge of this method in the following manner. For years, I have been occupied with the resolution of certain psychopathological structures, hysterical phobias, obsessional ideas, and the like, with therapeutic intentions. I've been so occupied, in fact, that ever since I heard the significant statement of Joseph Breuer to the effect that in these structures regarded as morbid symptoms, solution and treatment go hand in hand. Where it has been possible to trace a pathological idea back to those elements in the psychic life of the patient to which it owed its origin, this idea has crumbled away and the patient has been relieved of it. In view of the failure of our other therapeutic efforts, and in the face of the mysterious character of these pathological conditions, it seemed to me tempting, in spite of all the difficulties, to follow the method initiated by Breuer until a complete elucidation of the subject had been achieved. I shall have occasion elsewhere to give a detailed account of the form which the technique of this procedure has finally assumed, and of the results of my efforts. In the course of these psychoanalytic studies, I happened upon the question of dream interpretation. My patients, after I had pledged them to inform me of all the ideas and thoughts which occurred to them in connection with a given theme, related their dreams, and thus taught me that a dream may be interpolated in the psychic concatenation, which may be followed backwards from a pathological idea into the patient's memory. The next step was to treat the dream itself as a symptom, and to apply to it the method of interpretation which had been worked out for such symptoms. For this, a certain psychic preparation on the part of the patient is necessary. A twofold effort is made to stimulate his attentiveness in respect of his psychic perceptions, and to eliminate the critical spirit in which he is ordinarily in the habit of viewing such thoughts as come to the surface. For the purpose, of self-observation with concentrated attention, it is advantageous that the patient should take up a restful position and close his eyes. He must be explicitly instructed to renounce all criticism of the thought formations which he may perceive. He must also be told that the success of the psychoanalysis depends upon his noting and communicating everything that passes through his mind, and that he must not allow himself to suppress one idea because it seems to him unimportant or irrelevant to the subject, or another because it seems nonsensical. He must preserve an absolute impartiality in respect to his ideas, for if he is unsuccessful in finding the desired solution of the dream, the obsessional idea, or the like, it will be because he permits himself to be critical of them. I've noticed in the course of my psychoanalytic work that the psychological state of a man in an attitude of reflection is entirely different from that of a man who is observing his psychic processes. In reflection, there is a greater play of psychic activity than in the most attentive self-observation. This is shown even by the tense attitude and the wrinkled brow of the man in a state of reflection, as opposed to the mimic tranquility of the man observing himself. In both cases, there must be concentrated attention, but the reflective man makes use of his critical faculties, with the result that he rejects some of the thoughts which rise into consciousness after he has become aware of them, and abruptly interrupts others, so that he does not follow the lines of thought which they would otherwise open up for him, while in respect of yet other thoughts he is able to behave in such a manner that they do not become conscious at all, that is to say, they are suppressed before they are perceived. In self-observation, on the other hand, he has but one task, that of suppressing criticism. If he succeeds in doing this, an unlimited number of thoughts enter his consciousness which would otherwise have eluded his grasp. With the aid of the material thus obtained, material which is new to the self-observer, it is possible to achieve the interpretation of pathological ideas, and also that of dream formations. As will be seen, the point is to induce a psychic state which is in some degree analogous as regards the distribution of psychic energy, mobile attention, to the state of the mind before falling asleep, and also, of course, to the hypnotic state. On falling asleep, the undesired ideas emerge, owing to the slackening of a certain arbitrary and, of course, also critical action, which is allowed to influence the trend of our ideas. We are accustomed to speak of fatigue as the reason of this slackening. The emerging undesired ideas are changed into visual and auditory images in the condition which it utilized for the analysis of dreams and pathological ideas. This activity is purposely and deliberately renounced, and the psychic energy thus saved, or some part of it, is employed in attentively tracking the undesired thoughts which now come to the surface, thoughts which retain their identity as ideas, in which the condition differs from the state of falling asleep. Undesired ideas are thus changed into desired ones. There are many people who do not seem to find it easy to adopt the required attitude toward the apparently free-rising ideas, and to renounce the criticism which is otherwise applied to them. The undesired ideas habitually evoke the most violent resistance, which seems to prevent them from coming to the surface. But if we may credit our great poet-philosopher Friedrich Schiller, the essential condition of poetical creation includes a very similar attitude. In a certain passage in his correspondence with Körner, for the tracing of which we are indebted to Otto Rank, Schiller replies in the following words to a friend who complains of his lack of creative power. The reason for your complaint lies, it seems to me, in the constraint which your intellect imposes upon your imagination. Here I will make an observation, and illustrate it by an allegory. Apparently it is not good, and indeed it hinders the creative work of the mind, if the intellect examines too closely the ideas already pouring in, as it were, at the gates. Regarded in isolation, an idea may be quite insignificant, and venturesome in the extreme, but it may acquire importance from an idea which follows it. Perhaps in a certain collocation with other ideas, which may seem equally absurd, it may be capable of furnishing a very serviceable link. The intellect cannot judge all these ideas unless it can retain them until it has considered them in connection with these other ideas. In the case of a creative mind, it seems to me the intellect has withdrawn its watchers from the gates, and the ideas rush in pell-mell, and only then does it review and inspect the multitude. You worthy critics, or whatever you may call yourselves, are ashamed or afraid of the momentary and passing madness which is found in all real creators, the longer or shorter duration of which distinguishes the thinking artist from the dreamer. Hence your complaints of unfruitfulness, for you reject too soon and discriminate too severely. And yet such a withdrawal of the watchers from the gates of the intellect, as Schiller puts it, such a translation into the condition of uncritical self-observation is by no means difficult. Most of my patients accomplish it after my first instructions. I myself can do so very completely if I assist the process by writing down the ideas that flash through my mind. The quantum of psychic energy, by which the critical activity is thus reduced, and by which the intensity of self-observation may be increased, varies considerably according to the subject matter upon which the attention is to be fixed. The first step in the application of this procedure teaches us that one cannot make the dream as a whole the object of one's attention, but only the individual components of its content. If I ask a patient who is as yet unpracticed, "What occurs to you in connection with this dream?" he is unable, as a rule, to fix upon anything in his psychic field of vision. I must first dissect the dream for him. Then, in connection with each fragment, he gives me a number of ideas which may be described as the thoughts behind this part of the dream. In this first and important condition, then, the method of dream interpretation which I employ diverges from the popular, historical, and legendary method of interpretation by symbolism, and approaches more nearly to the second, or cipher method. Like this, it is an interpretation in detail, not en masse. Like this, it conceives the dream from the outset as something built up, as a conglomerate of psychic formations. In the course of my psychoanalysis of neurotics, I have already subjected perhaps more than 1,000 dreams to interpretation, but I do not wish to use this material now as an introduction to the theory and technique of dream interpretation, for quite apart from the fact that I should lay myself open to the objection that these are the dreams of neuropaths, so that the conclusions drawn from them would not apply to the dreams of healthy persons, there is another reason that impels me to reject them. The theme to which these dreams point is, of course, always the history of the malady that is responsible for the neurosis. Hence, every dream would require a very long introduction and an investigation of the nature and the etiological conditions of the psychoneuroses, matters which are in themselves novel and exceedingly strange, and which would therefore distract attention from the dream problem proper. My purpose is rather to prepare the way, by the solution of the dream problem, for the solution of the more difficult problems of the psychology of the neuroses. But if I eliminate the dreams of neurotics, which constitute my principal material, I cannot be too fastidious in my treatment of the rest. Only those dreams are left which have been incidentally related to me by healthy persons of my acquaintance, or which I find given as examples in the literature of dream life. Unfortunately, in all these dreams I am deprived of the analysis without which I cannot find the meaning of the dream. My mode of procedure is, of course, less easy than that of the popular cipher method, which translates the given dream content by reference to an established key. I, on the contrary, hold that the same dream content may conceal a different meaning in the case of different persons, or in different connections. I must therefore resort to my own dreams as a source of abundant and convenient material, furnished by a person who is more or less normal, and containing references to many incidents of everyday life. I shall certainly be confronted with doubts as to the trustworthiness of these self-analyses, and it will be said that arbitrariness is by no means excluded in such analyses. In my own judgment, conditions are more likely to be favorable in self-observation than in the observations of others. In any case, it is permissible to investigate how much can be accomplished in the matter of dream interpretation by means of self-analysis. There are other difficulties which must be overcome in my own inner self. One has a comprehensible aversion to exposing so many intimate details of one's own psychic life, and one does not feel secure against the misinterpretations of strangers. But one must be able to transcend such considerations. Tout psychologiste, writes Delboeuf, every psychologist is obliged to admit even his own weaknesses, if he thinks by that he may throw his light on a difficult problem. And I may assume for the reader that his initial interest in the indiscretions which I must commit will very soon give way to an exclusive engrossment in the psychological problems elucidated by them. I shall therefore select one of my own dreams for the purpose of elucidating my method of interpretation. Every such dream necessitates a preliminary statement, so that I must now beg the reader to make my interests his own for a time, and to become absorbed with me in the most trifling details of my life, for an interest in the hidden significance of dreams imperatively demands just such a transference. End of recording. End of section 10. Recording by Matthew Westra for LibriVox.